Welcome! In this Innovation Fun tutorial, we will walk you through an example of the application of the GHG calculator for a project aiming to reduce emissions in the mobility sector. During the application for the IF25 call, project proposals are assessed against several criteria, and the greenhouse gases, or GHG, emissions avoidance is one of them. Applicants must estimate the GHG emission avoidance based on the Innovation Fund's GHG methodology, and shall use the relevant Excel calculation tool. Both are published on the funding and tender portal. If you haven't already done so, we recommend reading the GHG methodology before watching this tutorial. If, after watching this tutorial, you still have questions, you can consult the FAQs in the funding and tender portal, or contact our dedicated help desk. The mobility calculation tool comprises 10 tabs. Some are informative, others are for mandatory completion. Throughout the calculator and this tutorial, the acronym MOB refers to the mobility sector. In the first Overview tab, you can find overall instructions about the tool and the color coding to identify mandatory cells that need to be filled in when completing the GHG calculation tool for your project. As shown in this colored table, blue cells identify cells where any information, activity data or consumption data shall be inserted. Light green cells indicate fields where there is a formula or links embedded. No inputs are required. Yellow cells indicate fields where you should select the appropriate option from a drop-down menu. Gray cells are for comments and other information about the data entered. Finally, hatched cells indicate fields where no data entry is required in the tool. This tab also includes additional information about the tool, such as a description of the contents of each tab, and the definitions of the acronyms used in the calculator. In this tutorial, we will discuss a hypothetical project in the mobility sector. The applicant proposes to replace 3 daily flights occurring to and from an island. One flight will be replaced with a maritime journey on a boat that is mostly powered by solar energy. The other 2 will be replaced with flights in a more efficient aircraft, fueled with sustainable aviation fuel instead of conventional jet fuel. There are 3 return journeys in both scenarios, but the project proposes a combination of a modal shift from an airplane to a boat, a fuel switch from conventional jet fuel to sustainable aviation fuel, and an energy efficiency improvement in the aircraft. This tutorial focuses on 4 main tabs. The 3 tabs that support your calculation, which are the Reference Emissions tab, the Project Emissions tab, and the Assumptions tab. And the Summary tab, which we will start from. The Summary tab, which you now see in the screen, is mostly populated automatically with inputs from the other tabs. This is also where you will find the final values that you will insert in your application. The absolute GHG emissions avoidance and the relative GHG emissions avoidance. You should start preparing your calculations by filling in the general information table. This should include the sector of the project and the principal product as well as other relevant parameters. I have pre-filled the tab with general information for this illustrative GHG calculation. I will now move to the Assumptions tab, which I have also already completed with the information about our hypothetical project. As your project is not yet up and running, you will need to adopt assumptions to predict your operational performance and calculate your reference and project emissions. These assumptions and the rationale for any qualitative or quantitative premises must be documented and properly referenced in this tab. In the reference scenario, we would have 3 return flights per day, each consuming 0.1 terajoules of Jet A1 kerosene. We assume that the service will run 360 days a year. In the project scenario, we will have 2 return flights per day in an aircraft that is 20% more efficient and runs on sustainable aviation fuel which has a 50% biofuel content. We assume that the service will run 360 days a year. The third flight will be replaced by a maritime journey on a boat that runs mostly on solar power and consumes a little bit of diesel oil. I have added some illustrative sources and references for this data. During your application, you must provide adequate and verifiable sources of information and add hyperlinks when possible. Now that we have the data to support our calculations outlined and documented, we will move to calculating the reference emissions. Our hypothetical example relates to a project that aims to provide a transport service of passengers as their principal product, which in this calculator is measured in person-kilometer. So as a first step, in row 20, I will estimate the amount of services delivered in the reference scenario, which will be calculated using the following assumptions. Number of flights per day. Number of days in operation. Capacity of the reference aircraft. And the distance of the return journey. This will result in 10,800,000 person-kilometer per year. I will then shift to the calculation of emissions for the delivery of these transportation services. In the reference scenario, we only have the aviation modal. In this case, we only need to calculate the quantity of jet kerosene consumed by the reference aircraft, in terajoules, in row 24. This energy consumption will be reduced or replaced with other energy sources by the project. The quantity of jet kerosene consumed in year 1 will be the fuel consumption per return flight, in terajoules, which is 0.1, times the number of return flights per day, which is 3, times the number of operation days in the year, which is 360. In this example, we will assume these operational characteristics will not change over the years. Therefore, I will replicate the annual energy consumption for the other years. A calculator filled clearly and correctly will facilitate evaluators' review of your project. Please always link calculations with the values in the Assumptions tab, if possible. Once we have added the information in row 24, the green cells in row 25 will be populated automatically to account for the additional, non-CO2, climate impacts from flights. Note that, for manufacturing projects, the reference calculation would be completed in the section below. From row 36 onwards. You will also notice that numbers start showing up in the green cells to the right of column S. Here, the yearly energy consumption we just calculated is multiplied by the relevant emission factors. This is all the data that is required to calculate the reference scenario emissions. Before we move to the next steps, I want to show you that the tab allows you to add information about the traceability of the data. In these fields, you must provide a brief description of your monitoring plan. It should include data sources, monitoring frequency, and QA procedures. Notice that your total reference emissions are now visible in the summary table at the top of the screen. Having calculated the reference emissions, we will now calculate the project emissions. Before you start, I recommend you go through the parameters to understand what each of them refers to. As mentioned previously, this hypothetical example will provide a transport service for passengers as the principal product. In such case, the applicant needs to build their assumptions considering the delivery of the same amount of services in the project scenario as the amount in the reference scenario. In this case, this equals 10,800,000 person-kilometer. In the project scenario, part of these services will be delivered by the 2 round-trip flights, which I have calculated in row 22. To compensate for the reduced number of journeys, the other part will be delivered by solar-powered boat, as indicated in row 33. I will again assume a constant volume of passengers over the years. We will start by calculating the parameters relating to the flights in the row specified for aviation, identified with T=A in column B. In this example, we will add calculations to row 24, row 28, and row 32. We will start by calculating the quantity of jet kerosene that will be consumed in the flights, in terajoules. In year 1, we will have the percentage of jet fuel in the sustainable aviation fuel, 1–50%, times the fuel consumption per return flight, 0.08 terajoules, times the number of return flights per day, 2, times the number of operating days in the year, 360, which gives us 29 terajoules. In this example, I will assume these operational characteristics will not change over the years, so we'll replicate this value for the other years. Similarly, we will calculate the quantity of biofuel that will be consumed in the flights. In year 1, we will have the percentage of biofuel in the sustainable aviation fuel, 50%, times the fuel consumption per return flight, 0.08 terajoules, times the number of return flights per day, 2, times the number of operating days in the year, 360, which also gives us 29 terajoules. The amount of jet kerosene and biofuel in our example is the same, because of the 50-50 split in the sustainable aviation fuel. I will again assume these operational characteristics will not change over the years, and replicate the value for the other years. In row 32, we need to add the additional non-CO2 climate impacts for aviation activities. The GHG methodology does not provide a specific formula for estimating this. Applicants should use their own methods and tools, and provide sufficient evidence to support calculations. The non-CO2 climate impact in our hypothetical project was calculated with a software that tracks full warming impact based on fuel burnt, altitude, speed, humidity of the air, and saturation of area. The result was 6,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, already deducting the warming contributions of the conventional GHG captured in former parameters. We will now calculate the parameters related to the boat journeys in the row specified for maritime transportation, identified by the T=M in column B. In this example, we will add calculations in row 33, row 39, and row 41. The amount of marine diesel oil consumed by the boat in year 1 will be the diesel demand in the boat per return trip, which corresponds to 5% of the total energy demand of the boat, multiplied by the number of return boat trips per day, and the number of operating days in the year. This gives us 0.1 terajoules of energy. I will assume this amount of energy consumption will remain constant over the years. The amount of solar energy consumed by the boat in year 1 will be the electricity demand in the solar-powered boat per return trip, which corresponds to 95% of the total energy demand of the boat, multiplied by the number of return boat trips per day, and the number of operating days in the year. This gives us 2 terajoules of energy. I will assume this amount of energy consumption will remain constant over the years, and manually add the emission factor for solar energy in column S, which is 0. I will again assume this will remain constant over the years. Finally, I will calculate the black carbon emissions generated by the boat in this hypothetical project. I will do this by dividing the quantity of diesel consumption per year that we just calculated by the fuel density. This will give me the quantity in tons. I will then multiply this by a factor that gives the number of tons of black carbon generated per ton of fuel, which gives 0.0004 tons of black carbon per year. I will replicate the calculation for the other years. Now that we have filled all the parameters, we can see that emissions are being calculated in the light green calculation columns to the right of column S. Don't forget to fill in the information in the data traceability columns, and to check the project emissions calculated in the summary table. We are now done with our calculations. Back in the Summary tab, after we have calculated our reference and project emissions, the indicators informing the two GHG emissions avoidance criterion will be automatically calculated by the spreadsheet. These are the absolute GHG emissions avoidance, calculated as the difference between reference and project emissions, and the relative GHG emissions avoidance, calculated by dividing the absolute reductions by the reference emissions. If you can see these two numbers, congratulations! You have successfully filled in the calculator tool. You should now use these results to fill in your application form. You will see that this tab includes other informative fields. You can use them to calculate the emissions intensity of your project, or how much your project will emit per unit. We invite you to revisit the calculator on your own time, particularly to familiarize yourself with the additional tabs that are part of the calculation tool. I hope you find this tutorial useful. If after this tutorial and reviewing the tool, you still have questions, please do not hesitate to submit a question via the help desk if the answer to your question is not included in the FAQ, available on the Funding and Tender portal. Please note that the help desk can only answer questions related to the methodology or the use of the tool. The help desk team cannot review calculations or validate assumptions that you intend to use for your project. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.